Hey everyone, welcome to episode 5 of Open Books with Alana and Erin, two female leaders modernizing the accounting space. And today we're going to tackle a hard subject head on. We're going to take it on, and that's critical conversations.
Yep.
It's a big one. A lot of anxiety.
Yep.
Might feel some emotions right now. So to start with, Erin, how do you view critical conversations?
So I think it's very common, and I used to think that what would be quote unquote critical conversations were only those about bad stuff, negative things. And that's changed over the years. But if you had talked to me in my early career, it'd be like, oh, I'm in trouble. Something has gone wrong.
Sure.
I've made a mistake. That's critical because it has to do typically with client interactions, a client relationship, and how I have messed things up. I do want to know I stopped myself from swearing right there.
Can you swear on a podcast?
You can.
We gotta look up the
We'll look
specifics.
up. Yeah. That took real thinking though. But for me, I used to think it was definitely just somewhat high stakes, and really only negative. But
Yep.
now, anytime I'm talking to a team member or talking to like my CEO or COO, and we're making decisions about the firm, good or bad, anything like that, those are critical.
Yeah.
They're important. It's not negative. So,
Sure.
and anytime my team wants to talk about their career moving forward, or if they're happy where they are, or they want to make changes, all of that is very critical.
Yeah.
And I consider it critical now, where before it was, and that's just conversations. How about
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, I echo what you say. Definitely thought it was more negative in the beginning, and then you realize critical does not mean bad inherently. I look at critical conversations now as a time almost like for everyone to reset, get on the same page, and move forward together. So I think I almost look at them as an opportunity, not always like some conversations can be tough, critical as well, but still that opportunity to like build trust with your team member or colleague or whoever you're talking with. When I first started my leadership journey, we did like a training on management, and so just some like what do you say in these moments, or here's some resources for you. And in the training they opened up the hard conversation section with a poll, and it said, how do you view critical conversations? And it was like, you dread them and you avoid them, right? And then there were some other answers, and then the last one was you fully welcome critical conversations. And when I was looking at that, I remember like, well, the only answer is that you dread them. Like this, there is only one answer here for everyone. And I just thought there is no way anyone welcomes a critical conversation.
Right.
And then they showed the results, and it was like those people, like some people view it as an opportunity. And
Yeah.
I just thought like, I will never get there because I like those critical conversations used to be very hard for me.
Yeah.
For sure a weakness of mine until I really like stopped avoiding it and just started to
Right.
work on it. So it's just funny how you come kind of full circle to now, if I had that question again, I would say, yeah, I do fully, welcome it.
Yeah.
So
Definitely the opportunity to talk about whatever is important to you in that moment or that team member.
Yep.
So we've talked about what critical conversations are to us.
Yep.
How do you know when one is coming up?
Gosh, and I think that's the trick, right? Is how do you know? Just so that you're not like blindsided or you're not running away from it. I try to pay attention to like the rumblings that are happening. And I think you can do that, whether you're in person or virtual, but comments made by employees, the sarcasm, I
Ooh,
think really tells you like there might be something more here. I do, pay attention to others as well when we're in like a group setting, if something was said or, there was a weird reaction, like to follow up with them. So I think just being in tune with your team
Hmm.
and kind of you can tell when the dynamic has kind of switched or when somebody, is making a few more jokes about something specific.
Yes.
You kind of catch on to that, I think, a little bit. What about you? How do you catch on or how
It's
do
very
you? Yeah.
similar. And with remote, it's because again, you can't see like someone's body language about stuff. It
Yep.
is a lot of listening, but then verifying as
Oh,
well.
sure. Okay.
So like if there was a sarcastic comment
Mhm.
made or something, I'm probably gonna follow up in our one-on-one and say like, hey, you said this. I just want to check and make sure that
Yep.
like, is there something that we need to talk about?
Yeah.
This isn't a big deal. I just want to make sure I'm making the door open
Yeah.
for them to bring it up. And if it is something that we need to talk about, then we can. But it's kind of seen as low stakes at that point. 'Cause
Sure.
it's just a one-on-one, just
Yep.
bringing it up from the last team meeting, which we do now that it's busy time.
Yeah.
We do Monday and Friday.
Okay.
So we dropped off Wednesday. But yeah, definitely listening to the rumblings. I have a significantly smaller team than you.
Yeah.
So I don't think we get the rumblings.
Okay.
And
yeah.
also because we aren't all together
Yep.
in different locations, we don't have that rumblings in person.
Oh, sure.
So
Yep.
I think it's easier for us to identify. Well, easier and harder.
Yeah.
Easier if they say something sarcastic, but
Yep.
also like we don't necessarily know if people are not content or
Yep.
happy because we don't get to see those rumblings. So in some aspects easier, some aspects
Yeah.
harder, but usually it's just a lot of listening.
Observing.
Yeah. And I will say, luckily, Chris and Sarah have done an amazing job hiring to fit the culture. So
Yep.
the team knows, hopefully, I think they do, that if there was something that we really needed to talk about,
Yep.
they would bring it up in our one-on-one, and we'd take it further if it needed to go anywhere. But
Yeah.
really just paying attention to the interactions, things that are happening in Slack or
Yes.
Teams.
Yep. That'll tell you a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So
for sure.
once you do, get into a critical conversation with
Mhm.
an employee, how do you handle that moment if the other person is not being proactive with you or I guess not participating
Mhm.
with you, right? How do you navigate that?
So I really struggle with that
Yeah.
because critical conversations, whether they're good or bad, I get very emotional
Yeah.
about things. At times, too emotional. I'll say it, too emotional. So when it comes to someone who's not feeding that like emotional
Yeah.
energy, I like try to do it even more and become
Oh,
more emotional.
interesting. Okay.
But it's something I'm aware of that
Yep.
I do. So I try to recognize it at that time and be like, this conversation in my head
Mhm.
is not going to resolve anything. We're not going to come to a consensus about
Yeah.
what's happening. So I will usually at that point ask them to think about 2 or 3 different things in regards to whatever we're talking about. And then we're going to meet in another week.
Yep.
I've given them some things that they need to do, and then they get space.
Yeah.
Because me getting more emotional and more boisterous, I guess is probably the best word, is going to make them turn inwards even more. That's how I handle it. I don't know if it's the right way. There's got to be other ways too. How about you?
Well, I'm kind of similar in, I think, so I don't always view critical conversations as one conversation.
Right.
I think, it can be a series.
Mhm.
So like you, when I can sense like we're not getting anywhere right now, and that's okay
Mhm.
because it might be that I've had to bring up something that the other person, it's sensitive for them or
Right.
you just don't know, what the other person might be perceiving in that moment.
Mhm.
So I, like you, will kind of set the stage in that moment and then say, okay, let's right now schedule a time for us to meet, the next day or the day after. I don't like to wait too long because then they can kind of sit and stir on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I also don't want them to carry anxiety
Oh,
until we
that's a
meet
good
again.
point. Yeah.
Like also me too. I want to take care of it. I don't want it to sit for them over a weekend
Mm-hmm.
and ruin their weekend. It's not worth it.
Right.
So I try to set it like within 20 to 48 hours. And then we come back and talk. And when we come back, I, kind of allow them to take the stage since I had the stage, to begin with.
Yeah.
So like you said, I don't know if that's right or wrong,
Right.
but I found that it maybe helps both sides be collaborative during that critical conversation is important.
Yeah. I like how you give that person, the other person, the opening at that second meeting. You've
Yeah.
brought up your stuff, you've shared your perspective, and then you give the next meeting to them.
Yeah.
As opposed to you leading all of it, because then to them it may feel like not as collaborative as you actually want it to be.
And it might be that it might be that that's what's shutting them down too, with some, I can think of, maybe some individuals who they feel like they're not in control of the meeting, and maybe that's what they need to feel comfortable,
Right.
To say their side.
Yeah.
Which is important.
It's interesting that you said that you try to do it within 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah.
As I had an experience with a team member who she wasn't really sure where she wanted to move into in the firm.
Yeah.
Like, did she want to focus on production?
Yeah.
Totally fine. Did she want to focus on leadership? Did she want to do advisory? What did she want to do? And she didn't really know. And I'd asked her a couple times.
Okay.
And it was a conversation we have in all of our quarterly evaluations. Like, where do you see yourself in a year? Where do you want to be? How can we support you and get you there? And it was a question that was dreaded by everyone who had to do the quarterly eval.
Yeah.
But for her, I wanted her to think about, spend the next 3 months really thinking about what she liked about the job.
Okay.
And what she really didn't like.
Yeah.
And then let me know. If it takes all 3 months, great. If it takes a week, if it takes 3 weeks, a month and a half, that's fine. But it gave her time to really think about, what was really interesting her.
Yeah.
Where she wanted to be with her current lifestyle, all of that. And I think in that case, giving the space worked really well.
Completely.
Because then I gave her the task.
Yep.
She needed to really figure out what she wanted to do. And then she came back just a couple weeks ago. We had a chat and she's like, I think this is where I want to look at. Like, that's great.
Yep.
This isn't a forever decision. If you want to still go a different direction, totally fine. But at least I can support you in moving this way. And that worked. But I think for your more... I don't want to say negative critical conversations, but ones that have an immediate impact. Definitely that 24 to 48 hours is something that I think I'll start implementing instead of a full week.
And I think, like you said, it just matters like what you're talking about, and what the critical conversation is about. Because in your example, you set the stage and then she needed time to actually have real, examples and like hands-on to really see. And you're correct when I'm thinking about some of my critical conversations where we do that 24 to 48 hour turnaround. I don't want them to stir on it and like I said to lose their peace over it, because I don't think it's not necessary.
Also, I wonder, with you being in person, if it gives them time, if you did a week or 2 weeks or longer, if it gives them time to stir up the other team members.
And that's a very good point that it does as well. And it starts to seep out. And if how I view critical conversations of being like building that trust between myself and that other person, not that it, is by any means like secretive, but I want that, for us to be able to come to a place together about it. Because then all of a sudden now you have to you know,
extend
clean up.
that conversation. Clean up is the
Yeah.
perfect term
Yeah.
to make sure that you're addressing not only that initial critical conversation, but
Yep.
then your next one. And you probably have to do some coaching around
For sure.
the conversations
Yep.
you have with coworkers and
Yeah.
making sure that they are productive.
Yep.
And so we all need to vent sometimes. I will
And
say.
there is healthy venting for
Yes.
sure. I think too, I try to do it especially with like new employees, the 24 to 48 hour turnaround, because I think critical conversations can sometimes be a really big piece of a toxic work environment, how they're
Yes.
handled.
Mhm.
I think critical conversations really kind of define some of the culture of a firm.
Yes.
And so I find for new employees, I want to not act too quick, but I want to show them that like we can talk about it, we can come to a collaborative resolution, and we can keep moving on together.
Mhm.
And I want that to happen within a reasonable amount of time so that they're not like wondering what's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, I want them to see action.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
That it just remembering back to like coming out of what I would consider a toxic work environment
Yeah.
back in olden days,
Yeah.
before we
Yep.
started working with our mentor and
Yeah.
everything. But now, like new people coming into the firm, our culture is quite different
Mhm.
and very open, and they have some form of trauma
For sure.
coming
Yep.
out of those more traditional firms.
Totally.
And you can definitely tell those individuals whose only critical conversations
Yeah.
they've had or been a part of have been extremely negative.
Yes.
And it's so disappointing.
Yep.
And I think a big part of why we wanted to do this podcast so
Yeah.
that it's people know what we would have told ourselves,
Yeah.
that it doesn't have to be that way.
Totally.
You don't have to manage from fear.
Yep.
You want to have open conversations, and not everything's always going to be hunky dory all the time.
Totally.
But yeah, that's a really good point about the individuals coming in from
Yep.
a toxic work environment and their experience with critical conversations, and how you kind of have to, I don't know, not baby them, but like baby bird them almost.
Well,
like,
and I think like show them results in that
Yes,
moment.
yeah.
Yeah. Like give them tangible pieces
mhm,
or, you know, like results to look at.
Right.
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 Is that what you would tell yourself previously?
Not. It's not the one that I have
Yeah.
planned.
Okay.
But I would.
Yeah.
I wish I could go back and say, like, hey, not all of these conversations are negative.
Yep,
You
totally.
can experience a really good leadership relationship and have very important conversations
Yep.
that are not just negative.
Totally.
And then I would feel heard. And I know that was a big change when we had the management switch and
Yeah.
started working with Tony, is I felt heard.
Yep.
And as an individual, I felt like I had an impact on where I was going, how things were happening. Didn't really have that before. And any
Yeah.
conversation was typically a negative one.
Totally. Yep.
But yeah, how about you?
Yeah, I think to kind of spin off yours, what I would tell myself is it's not always yes or no in those critical conversations. And I also view like yes or no, like you versus me versus them.
Right.
The best critical conversations are very collaborative.
Mhm.
And they actually find a resolution between both parties. And it's not just one person speaking the whole time. You get told how you need to move forward, and that's the end.
Yep.
Right? It's critical conversations should actually be very collaborative. And I think, you know, if possible, both parties walk away feeling good about it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you, kind of thinking about the traditional accountants
Yeah.
and old school management,
Yep.
everything's very data based, objective viewpoints based.
Totally. Yeah.
How, and I think some of that resonates with the people that we lead, our teams.
Sure. Yeah.
But how do you manage the feelings versus data driven
Yeah.
critical conversations when you do have to have kind of a more negative conversation?
So I have found that the feelings and the emotions actually are a really great tool in those conversations. I don't view emotions or feelings as bad.
Mhm.
I think like I said, they can totally be a tool. And so I have found and sometimes they can be the most like the biggest tool for you to really know what's going on with that
Mhm.
person. So when I, am in a critical conversation and someone starts showing that emotion, I use that as a sign to kind of help guide my conversation. So I've been in some critical conversations where there's been very big feelings. It
Mm.
unfortunately wasn't, it was more of a negative critical conversation, unfortunately. And there was a lot of really big emotions coming. And so I used that moment to ask them what that feeling is for them, where that emotion is coming from, because that felt bigger than what we needed to talk about in the critical
Mm.
conversation. And so asking, where that emotion is coming from, it helped me kind of guide the conversation that way. But also, if I see a team member starting to shut down during a conversation, or their emotion might not match what I've just expressed, I also use that as a time, and I'll, ask them to tell me what you just heard me say,
Mhm.
because it's not matching with my perception of what I just said. So like I take that moment to like make sure that we have the same understanding of what I'm saying in the conversation, or what they just said.
Right.
So like I said, I use it definitely as a tool. And I don't view it as a bad thing if a party is showing strong emotion,
Right.
right? Because they're bringing their whole self to the
Mhm.
conversation. So it actually shows that maybe they're fully engaged in the
That's-
conversation.
I was just about
Yeah.
to say that
Yeah.
emotion can show that they
Yes.
care.
Yes.
We had an employment event a couple months ago,
Yeah.
and the as we were having this conversation, it was not a conversation you typically want to have. We were letting someone go.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we did wrong in that
Okay.
whole conversation. But as I look back, as I'm listening to you talk about that
Mhm.
emotion, I'm looking back at that event and realizing that the individual in that conversation showed no emotion.
Okay. Yeah.
And it could have been that it's just how that person is.
Sure.
Also, we're doing things remote, so maybe
Yep.
if we had been in person, it would have been different. But it really makes me wonder, like, okay, it actually makes me feel better. You know, I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, I made the right decision, or we made the right decision.
Because they weren't
Because-
connected.
Yeah, because they
yeah.
weren't connected, they weren't
Yeah.
engaged, and that was that. So it actually kind of makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because you were right. If someone's showing emotion, it typically means that they care about what's happening.
Right.
Usually, not
Yeah.
all the time, but
Yeah.
it's a pretty good indicator, I would say.
Yeah. So you talked about that recent event that
Mhm.
you had. That is a very big critical conversation,
Right.
right? And since it's kind of recent, is there any takeaway you have from that, or like, here's like what I would do differently next time?
Yes. Oh, so many.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
many. And they're like the things that everyone says. Have an agenda when you go
Oh,
in.
sure.
So we had planned what we were going to say,
Yep.
and what we thought their response was going to be was the exact opposite
Oh, interesting.
what actually happened.
Okay.
We thought it was going to be a pretty antagonistic conversation based on things that had happened previously, just based on our interactions
Okay.
before.
Yeah.
And it was the exact opposite. And so we were really scrambling for like, well, what do we say? How do we even have this conversation now?
We didn't plan for this.
Right.
Yeah.
So while we had a loose agenda,
Mhm.
I wish that we had a more structured agenda and had role played together with
yeah.
multiple responses
Scenarios,
back.
for
Yeah,
sure.
like
Yeah.
okay, if they're antagonistic back, this is what we're gonna do.
Yep.
If they're silent.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to do.
Yep.
Because it was not a great experience for us. I'm sure it wasn't for them.
Yeah.
And it was like leaving that meeting felt horrible for, I imagine, everyone in the
Yep.
meeting. I know for me and Sarah at the time, like we felt like shit, pardon the language, but
Yeah, I get it.
it was just negative all around.
Yeah.
And I wish we could have had a much more, I don't know, clear conversation on the issues that we were experiencing and all of that. But but yes, agenda,
Yeah.
role play
Yep.
from different scenarios. If you think it's going to go one way, make sure you talk through if it goes 180 degrees, because we were at a standstill.
I'm sure.
And didn't know how to have that conversation.
And by agenda, like I imagine that for this critical conversation, not something that you're going to send to the other party.
Correct.
Right? So is agenda more like, here's what we need to hit type of thing between the common parties before you go in?
Yep.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Your talking points, basically.
Yep.
Not an official agenda going out to
For sure.
everyone.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely where where we actually learned so much about having those conversations, and it was not fun. It was a learning experience for everyone involved, but it was painful.
But I think, and that's a good point though about critical conversations. If you can, because critical conversations can bring a lot of anxiety, but if you can step yourself out of that anxiety and look at, okay, how could that have gone better next time? Here's what I'm going to take away from that next time. Like, these were good things to rely on.
Right.
These are things that, maybe I'll switch up for the next time. But I feel like each critical conversation you have then going forward, you're like a little bit stronger going into the next one, because you've had, unfortunately, some of these like real examples, good and bad.
Yeah.
But I feel like each one, is like a building block to make you stronger.
For sure.
Yeah.
And like I said, we learned a lot out of that.
Yeah.
We know things that we definitely won't do again, what we will do. This summer's been last summer, huge learning experience.
Yeah.
So I have shared what I learned from my team.
Yeah.
What about you?
Mine would be just going back to, I've learned to read body language, read the emotion of my team. Because like I've touched on a couple times now, critical conversations started with being an uncomfortable place for me. And so I was so wrapped up in my headspace during the meeting, like in just trying to get through and like think through what I needed to talk about and make sure you say this. And I was so hung up on my end that for a while it didn't allow me to receive or to observe in the moment what that other person, was feeling or portraying. So I've learned to let the meeting be more organic and natural and, observe what that other person is putting out there. Because I think that is really where you have the strongest meetings in those moments.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's
awesome.
great.
This was a good one.
Yes.
Action-packed for sure.
Definitely.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to Open Books. We hope that by bringing forward our lessons learned along the way during our time in the accounting industry, that others can learn from us and share in our journey as we evolve as leaders in the accounting industry.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.